Okay, so continuing on from our poll, what what we're here to talk about today is again some disruptions that have happened in the solid waste industry that have affected some of your services. And so what those two major events really are is the first is obviously COVID, which we are not alone in that there has been disruptions in that. But in 2018, there was a new policy called the China National Sword Policy, and basically what it meant was that the recyclables that we had shipped to China from the U.S., and particularly in California, we were able to get away with, I guess, a little bit of a contamination rate of things that were not supposed to be in our recycling of about 10%, and that was still allowed, so that when we ship them to China to make new recycled products, that was allowed. And in 2018, China decided, as part of the National Sword Policy, to reduce the amount of contamination from 10% to 0.5% of what was in our bales. And really what that meant for us is that we had to do a lot more processing and cleaning up of our recycling at our material recovery facilities where we process recyclables, and make sure that they were clean and appropriate to be shipped to China and still have them be accepted and turned into new products. And really what that meant for the recycling industry as a whole is that the industry went from being a net profit of something that we were able to help offset some of the other more costly aspects of our garbage and organics processing streams, to something that was an expense. And really, we saw a lot of changes in our recycling markets with that policy. But really what we're here to talk about today are organics and organic materials. And to start out, I really just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page of what organic material actually means, because it may have been something that you weren't aware of, or something that there's a lot more materials that are organic materials. So you're probably very used to grass clippings, yard trimmings, things like that going into your green bin. And those are always organic materials. Those have been part of the city's program for a long time now. But as a part of this new policy, things like food scraps and food soiled paper, so used coffee filters, extra food trimmings after you've prepped meals, leftover stuff like that, will all be able to go into your organic bin. And so that's going to be something that is a big change to your service, and it'll be rolled out in this year and into next year, by January 1, 2022. So this is something that the city is actively working on in terms of the residential side, of making sure that you will be able to put your food scraps and food sold paper into your organics bins at home, and also negotiating actively with American Refuse, which is your commercial, garbage and recycling provider, or commercial recycling and organics provider, and allowing that service to exist in the future. But why are we talking about organics today, and why are they so important on the topic of SB 1383? And the main thing is that organics is a huge part of our waste stream. So the state of California, every couple of years, does a waste characterization study. And what that really means is that the state determines what is in our trash by a series of audits, basically digging through trash to figure out what is in there, what's currently being disposed. And each year, and especially this past year, there's a very common theme that there's a lot of organic material in our garbage, about 20 to 23 million tons of organic material. So it's a huge part of our waste stream, about 2/3. In addition, we throw away a lot of edible food, so things that could be recovered to feed hungry people. California's 1 in 8 Californians are food insecure. And so we're throwing away a lot of organic material, our yard trimmings, and we're also throwing away a lot of edible food. And so this is kind of the precipice of why SB 1383 was passed into law. And additionally, why we're talking about organics in our waste stream and why they're not so good to be a part of our garbage stream is not only because we want to recover edible food and make sure that people are fed in that we are investing in our composting programs and doing a good job with that, increasing our diversion rate, sending less things away from landfill. But organic material, when it's in a landfill, actually breaks down into methane gas. And methane's a super pollutant. It's much more powerful than CO2. And so California has developed a series of policies and laws that are trying to reduce, our overall greenhouse gas emissions. And getting organics out of landfills is a really good way to do that. So I wanted to touch a little bit on some of the state laws that you may have heard of, you may not have heard of in the past, and really what led up to SB 1383 coming into play. So in 1989, there was the AB 939 Act, and that really established for the first time in the state of California recycling and curbside recycling for Californians. It also required the state for the first time in each individual city to have a 50% diversion rate. And what that really means is that 50% of each city's overall waste stream had to go to either recycling or composting to be diverted away from landfill. In 2006, there was the Global Warming Solutions Act. This was California, some of its first bills on trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We also had AB 341 and AB 1826, which you may have heard of or read on the city's website. These bills are really targeting commercial recycling and commercial organics recycling. So if you have a business that generates a certain amount of garbage or recycling and organics per week, you would be subject to these laws. And so these have been in effect for a little while now. However, they don't have the state did not develop a robust enforcement mechanism for these. So they are laws. Now most businesses are required in multifamily properties to have recycling and organic service, but SB 1383 really hones in on that more, has more requirements. And a key part that we'll be talking about is the enforcement piece of SB 1383. In 2020, we also had AB 827, which is a fairly new bill that businesses must provide organics and recycling bins in the front of house at businesses. So if you have a garbage container at your restaurant or business, you'd also be required to have recycling and organics containers so that customers and employees can recycle and compost their materials correctly. And it leads up to SB 1383. We've talked now a little bit about it, but it was written into law in 2016, and it goes into effect in January 1, 2022. So in about 9 months from now. And SB 1383 is going to change the game again with organics and really requiring all residents and businesses, regardless of the amount of waste they generate, to have organic service. So just to touch a little bit more on what some of the requirements are of SB 1383, first and foremost, it's an unfunded state mandate. And what that means is that the state of California passed this into law, but is not helping cities and counties across California with implementing the law financially. So cities are having to figure out how they're going to provide these services for everyone and make sure that they're in compliance. So some of the requirements, as we already kind of pointed out, the first main one is that the city is going to have to provide organic waste collection for all residents and the vast majority of businesses. There's going to be a lot more education and outreach to generators, so our residents, commercial businesses, multifamily properties, on what goes where, how to put things in the right bin, etc. There's also an establishment of an edible food recovery program, which really hones in on that 1 in 8 Californians being food insecure, and the city and the counties across California are going to have to develop edible food recovery programs that take edible food from businesses, grocery stores, places like that, and distribute it to food banks, other places that are able to distribute the food to hungry people. The city's going to also have to inspect and enforce generators for compliance with SB 1383. And this is a key issue. If the city does not enforce or inspect, the city is actually held, will be enforced upon by CalRecycle, which is the state's waste and recycling governing body. And the fines can be pretty steep. They're up to $10,000 a day for the city not to be in compliance with the state law. So the city is going to have to enforce the requirements of this bill. And finally, there's going to be some facility capacity planning, other things like that, to make sure that we have enough composting facilities available so that all this new compost can actually go somewhere. And finally, the cities and businesses are going to have to share the cost of all these new program changes. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to move on from this poll a little bit of if people have organic service or not, but it leads really into how to get into compliance with SB 1383. So the easiest way to get into compliance with SB 1383 is if you just sign up for your organic service. If you're a business, that would be through American Refuse. And if you're a resident, you would already have your green bin as part of your residential service with the city. And so you'd be covered and in compliance. If you are, for instance, a grocery store, you may backhaul your organics, which really means that instead of having organics carts and bins, dumpsters, and containers, you bring all that material back to a distribution center or another place where it then gets recycled another way. And so if you are backhauling your organics, what you can do is you can complete a self-haul form. It's on the city's website. Submit it to the city to verify that you are in fact recycling organics. It's just not through the program with American Refuse, and you'd be in compliance with state law. Similarly, if you self-haul organics to a composting facility, which means if you yourself bring the organic material, your yard trimmings, whatnot, to a composting facility, you can also be exempt or, get a self-haul form from the city's website and be in compliance with the state law. This also goes for if you have a landscaping company that comes into your business and landscapes your business. They would have to maintain records of your weight tickets, what facility was used, and the tonnage so that the city could verify that the material is actually being recycled. But either way, you'd be in compliance with state law. If either you are self-hauling or you have a company that comes on site and self-hauls, you would just need to report that to the city. If you do not have space for organics or you don't generate organics, you may be available to have an exemption form or a waiver from SB 1383. And so what those really mean are, one, if you don't have space for organics containers, that really means in terms of your enclosure space. So if there's simply no possible way for you to have organic service, you could apply for a waiver form. It's on the city's website, and the city staff would come and visit the site or American Refuse, and you would be verified if there was no possible way to have space. If you don't generate organic waste material, that really means there's a very specific threshold that the state has created for that. And what they've come up with is 10 gallons of organic waste per week or less. And it seems a little hard to imagine, but I've really been trying to think about it in terms of 5-gallon buckets that you may get from Home Depot or something like that. If you generate about 2 of those per week, you would have to have the organic service. But if you don't generate enough of that, say you're a dentist's office, you maybe have 5 or so employees who eat their lunch and there's very minimal scraps, food scraps or whatnot, you may be able to apply for a waiver at the city's website again. The city would verify that, or American Refuse staff, and you would be exempt from the requirements for a period of 5 years. So once that's on file, you're good to go for 5 years. And finally, if you don't have organic service, you'd have to contact American Refuse for your service. They would deliver your cart or bin, and you'd be in compliance with state law. To touch a little bit on edible food recovery, We did want to talk about this because it's a little confusing, and we want to make sure that everyone who is covered and has to donate edible food understands what the requirements are. So starting in January 1, 2022, 9 months from now, if you are in the tier 1, so the way the states define that is a supermarket, a large grocery store, food service provider, food distributor, or a wholesale food vendor, you will be required to start donating edible food. And this actually may already be happening if you're a manager or owner of this business, a business like this. And we would just have to verify that with some documentation, which we'll get to in following slides. And starting in 2024, so in a couple years from now, large restaurants, hotels, health facilities and hospitals, large venues and events, state agencies with large cafeterias, and education agency facilities will have to also start donating edible food. So if you're covered, there's a couple things that you'll have to do. The first thing is that you'll have to recover the maximum amount of edible food that would otherwise be disposed. And so edible food, there's, we can talk a little bit more about what that means, but edible food really is meant to meet all the requirements of food safety laws. But you'll want to make sure, there we go. Hi, Ruby.
Hi. Good evening to everyone. Sorry, I was in a school meeting. This meeting might be over, I'm not sure, but I figured I'd join to see if it wasn't over.
Yeah, no problem. We're halfway through it or so, and maybe I'll keep going, and then I'll bring it around and let you know if you have any questions, and finish up that way. That works.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. So we're talking about edible food recovery, and it's a requirement of a new state law. And so again, if you're covered, to back up a little bit, we do have some requirements for if you're a large grocery store or supermarket, a food service provider, a food distributor or a wholesaler, you'll have to start donating edible food starting in January 1, 2022. And in tier 2, 2024, there would be large restaurants, hotels with on-site facilities, health venues or health facilities, large venues and events, and other large buildings with cafeterias. So what you'd have to do is just recover the maximum amount of edible food recovery or edible food that would otherwise be disposed. You'd have to have a written contract with a food recovery organization. And we have sample contracts on the Cower Cycle website if you're in need of a contract. And you'd have to maintain a record of food recovery organizations that you donate to, the copy of the contracts, and the types of food that will be collected and transported, the frequency and the quantity of edible food. And like I said, tier 1 must be in compliance by January 1, 2022. So again, those large grocery stores, wholesale food vendors, things like that. And a food recovery organization, we've talked a little bit about, that you have to donate to those places, but what is an actual food recovery organization? So I provided a couple examples of some in the area, but this could be anything from a food bank that we have here, the Community Action Partnership of Kern Food Bank, the California Central Food Bank, and we also have some businesses like Food Shift and Replate and Copia, which are businesses that specialize in recovering prepared food. So that's typically what's going to happen in more of the requirements of the January 1, 2024 group. And so, the food banks, this is typically the type of edible food they recover already, cans, dried goods, things like that. And the cities must maintain, as a part of the SB 1383 requirements, a list of all of the food recovery organizations in the area on its website. And as a part of this all these different requirements, the city is going to have to update its municipal code to codify the mandatory recycling and organics, the edible food recovery, and everything else. And so that's going to be happening in a summer of 2021. And the changes are going to really include what we've already talked about today: the mandatory recycling and organics, edible food recovery, and penalties for non-compliance beginning in January 1 of 2024. And if you're a business, your organic service is going to be provided to you by American Refuse. And if you're a resident, you will already have had your green bin provided by the city, and you would now be allowed to put in your food scraps as well into your containers. So if you're a business without recycling organics, you'll receive a letter from American Refuse detailing upcoming changes once the city has finished negotiations with American Refuse. If you believe that you're exempt from not generating organics, you can contact the city or download one of the waiver forms on the city's website and send them to the city for verification. And there's a whole lot of more information on the city's website about all these state laws, different requirements, and they'll be able to keep that updated. We also have a business survey available at this QR code to learn a little bit more about the SB 1383 program changes and hear more from you about your thoughts and concerns. So that is available and still open. It is in both Spanish and English. And we can end with some questions.